Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're pleased to have Mark Carroll with us today to describe the pathway to getting paid for new medical technologies in the US. Before we get started, a few technical items. If your connection is lost, simply log in again using your registration link. In the event that you are unable to log back in, all attendees will receive a link to the event recording at the conclusion of today's webinar. First, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Mark Carroll was trained as a neurosurgeon, but has spent most of his career developing paradigm-shifting technologies in many fields, including image-guided stereotactic neurosurgery, intensity-modulated and image-guided radiation therapy, electronic brachytherapy, and most recently in therapeutic ultrasound. The former CEO of Sonicare Medical, Mark joined the foundation a year ago as a senior consultant, focusing on reimbursement and regulatory issues. Mark will walk us through his presentation, which will then be followed by a question and answer session. You're encouraged to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now I'll turn things over to Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning. Today's presentation, sponsored by the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, is on the pathway to getting paid for new medical technology in the United States. High five, champagne. You've got your new medical device through the FDA. Time to get your product on the market, get hospitals buying it and doctors using it, and start making money. This is the commonly held understanding within the medical device arena, that FDA authorization is the big obstacle to success, that once a new technology receives FDA authorization to be sold, it is time to break out the champagne, it is time to start selling, financial success is surely awaiting. Well, while this may be the case for technologies where reimbursement code, payment, and coverage already exist, unfortunately, it is not the case for truly innovative technology. Here, the path to practitioner and hospital receiving payment from insurance payers for using the technology, without which there will be few devices sold, is much more complex. The process whereby a novel device, once created and proven clinically, makes its way to clinical adoption and commercial success is a highly integrated, interconnected, and complex process involving multiple federal agencies, government programs, commercial insurers, professional societies, technology assessment organizations, hospitals, and medical practitioners. The journey along this process pathway includes different regulatory options related to authorization for sale of the technology, as well as reimbursement-related steps involving multiple players related to the issuance of a code, the designation of a payment for that code, and decisions by public and commercial payers as to whether the code will be paid, all influenced by clinical data, professional society input, and utilization data, ultimately and hopefully leading to the physician and facility being paid by insurance for performing the procedure. This presentation will explore the entire pathway in detail. It is hoped that an understanding of the entire pathway at the very beginning of the journey will help a company navigate it in the most efficient and cost-effective manner, not just for each individual step, but over the entire pathway. This graphic displays the full complexity of the pathway to be explored. The presentation will begin with an overview based upon a much simpler model, then move on to explore in depth the steps that make up the complete pathway, including the intricacies of the connections that may exist between the steps and several external factors that may impact the outcome of each step. There are four main takeaways from this presentation, necessary but not sufficient to realize regulatory and payment success with a new technology. First, although FDA regulatory authorization usually precedes reimbursement decisions, strategies for both should be formulated at the same time, bringing their needs for R&D, clinical studies, and marketing in line with each other to minimize cost and time to market and maximize the potential for commercial success. Second, Specifically, and of critical importance, is the recognition that the clinical data required during the reimbursement process may in fact need to be of greater rigor than that required during the regulatory process, and should be considered upfront when making regulatory decisions and designing clinical trials. Third, professional societies and other organizations impact the pathway at multiple touch points, perhaps most importantly when it comes to realizing insurance coverage by commercial payers. Inclusion in published clinical guidelines may be the key to obtaining commercial coverage and achieving broad-scale clinical adoption. Finally, every hospital performing a procedure that uses the device must be coached in the need for and how to create a charge master or bill that reflects an accurate and complete cost of performing the procedure. This is a must if CMS is to assign a payment sufficient to cover the cost of performing the procedure. This cannot be emphasized strongly enough. This simplified model of the pathway will provide a general overview of the steps this presentation will explore and the major components of each step. The pathway is divided into two distinct but interconnected categories: regulatory and reimbursement. Regulatory covers receiving authorization from the FDA to sell a technology, while reimbursement covers the steps necessary to get paid by insurance payers for using the technology. It includes creating a code used by hospitals and payers to designate the procedure, assigning a payment to the code that would be paid if a payment is made, making a coverage decision as to whether to make the payment, and finally, getting paid. Coding, payment, and coverage decisions by federal and commercial payers often follow different sequences through the pathway. While there are exceptions to every rule, for instance, with a Category 3 CPT code, although highly unlikely, there is the potential for payment without regulatory authorization. In general, the process flows from regulatory through coding to assignment of payment to determining coverage, with the final step being payers paying the physician and/or facility. Influencing the entire pathway in varying ways and to varying degrees at different stages are clinical data and professional societies. Professional societies and technology assessment companies impact the pathway at multiple touch points, perhaps most importantly when it comes to realizing insurance coverage by commercial payers. Inclusion in clinical guidelines may be the key to obtaining commercial insurance coverage and, in turn, achieving broad-scale clinical adoption. Clinical data is required in some form at multiple steps in the pathway. It should be appreciated that the data may need to be of greater rigor during the reimbursement process than during the regulatory process. Knowing this upfront may impact the type of regulatory path chosen for a given technology. Clinical utilization, meaning how many cases are being performed with or without reimbursement, has a role to play in the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS's coding process, and in public insurance coverage steps. How cases are billed to CMS play a major role in determining initial payment rates and how they change over time. The result is a complete pathway that takes a technology from regulatory authorization through to payments being made to the physician and/or hospital by insurance payers. Yet the actual process is way more complicated. With the background provided by this overview, we can proceed to examining in detail the component blocks of the pathway. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, regulatory authorization is required to sell a device in the USA. There are three main paths towards achieving regulatory authorization in the US: PMA approval, 510(k) clearance, and de novo grant. There are also several less well-known pathways applicable to select products or markets, and there are additional pathways under consideration by the FDA, each designed to be sensitive to the needs of specific patient populations, such as pediatrics. Pre-market approval, or PMA, is the FDA regulatory review process established to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of Class 3 medical devices. Class 3 devices support or sustain human life, are of substantial importance in preventing impairment of human life, health, or which present a potential unreasonable risk of injury or illness. PMA is the most stringent type of FDA device marketing application. It requires usually the performance of a rigorous clinical trial with stringent performance criteria approved by the FDA at the start of the trial and with oversight provided by investigational review boards or IRBs. Insight Exablate and Exablate Neuro received regulatory authorization in the US via the PMA process. A 510K is a pre-market submission made to the FDA to demonstrate that the device to be marketed is as safe and effective that is substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device. Submitters must compare their devices to one or more similarly legally marketed devices and make and support their substantial equivalence claims. A legally marketed device is a device that was legally marketed prior to May 28, 1976, or a device which has been reclassified from Class 3 to Class 2 or 1, a device that has been found substantially equivalent through the 510K process, or a device that was granted marketing authorization via the de novo classification process. A 510K almost always does not provide marketing authorization for a specific clinical indication, which would usually require a formal clinical trial and therefore the PMA route. Profound Tulsa Pro realized marketing clearance via this route. The de novo process provides a pathway to classify novel medical devices for which general controls alone, or general and specific control, provide reasonable reassurance of safety and effectiveness for the intended use, but for which there is no legally marketed predicate device. Clinical data is required usually to demonstrate at a minimum safety and is sometimes required to also establish device effectiveness. A de novo grant almost always does not provide marketing authorization for a specific clinical indication, which again usually would require a formal clinical trial and therefore the PMA route. Upon successful review of a de novo submission, the FDA creates a classification for the device, a regulation if necessary, and identifies any special controls required for future pre-market submissions of substantially equivalent devices. Sonoblate, Ablatherm, and Focal One were granted marketing authorization via the de novo route. The cost for these three submission types vary greatly, as you can see from this table. It's important to note that for the de novo application, which is significantly more expensive than a 510K, but not as expensive as a PMA, if you are a small business, there is a fee that's approximately 25% of the normal fee available to you. Human device exemption, an HDA program, is a regulatory path by the FDA for products intended to treat diseases or conditions that affect small or rare populations of not more than 8,000 patients. An HDE device is exempt from the effectiveness requirements of other authorization pathways, but is subject to certain profit and use restrictions once the device is commercialized. The Breakthrough Devices Program is a relatively new voluntary program for certain medical devices and device-led combination products that provides for more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases or conditions. The program was created to provide patients and health providers with timely access to these medical devices by speeding up their development, assessment, and review while preserving the statutory standards for free market approval, 510K clearance, and de novo marketing authorization. Breakthrough designated devices receive prioritized review. A breakthrough device is designated by the FDA after manufacturer application, provides for more effective treatment of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating human disease or conditions, and either one is a technology breakthrough, two, a solution for which there are no approved alternatives, or three, one that offers a significant improvement compared to other alternatives. The acoustic technology has been granted breakthrough status by the FDA. Reimbursement is the process whereby an insurance payer covers part or all of the cost of a procedure and is based on claims and documentation filed by providers using medical diagnosis and procedure codes. Coding is the first step in the process and involves assigning a designator or designators by which a procedure can be billed by physicians and/or hospitals. Without a code, it is very difficult to bill a payer. A current procedural terminology, or CPT code, is a 5-digit number, for instance 75497, assigned to every task and service a practitioner may provide to a patient, including medical, surgical, and diagnostic, and is used for billing purposes. CPT codes are developed, maintained, and copyrighted by the American Medical Association, or AMA, and cover facility and physician services. They are used by both public and commercial payers. CPT codes that describe similar procedures within a given area of specialization can be assigned to groupings known as ambulatory payment classifications, or APCs. As an example, urology and related services have been assigned to 8 different APC levels. Each level can have dozens of procedures associated with it. As an example, CPT 75497, prostate tissue ablation with HIFU, has been assigned to APC 5375. Procedures within an APC are supposed to be similar in terms of the type of service they provide or condition that they treat, as well as their cost to perform. APCs only apply in the outpatient setting. Healthcare Common Procedural Coding System codes, or HCPCS codes, are maintained by CMS and used to bill procedures by Medicare, Medicaid, and other third-party payers. There are 2 levels of codes. Level 1 codes are based on CPT codes and used for services and procedures performed by physicians. Level 2 codes cover healthcare services and procedures that are not provided by physicians. Level 1 codes are copyrighted by the AMA, just like CPT codes. The HCPCS code used by Medicare is the same as the code used for CPT by commercial carriers. C code, for instance C9747, are unique temporary HCPCS codes established by CMS that apply only to the hospital, outpatient facility, and the ambulatory surgery center, or ASC. They do not apply to the office setting, nor do they cover physician services. A C code may be issued following an application by a manufacturer of a new technology when a permanent CPT or HCPCS code has not yet been issued. They usually are temporary, in place until such time a CPT code is issued to replace it, but can, in rare instances, exist concurrent with the CPT code. C codes can be very useful to the manufacturer of a new technology during the period relatively soon after regulatory authorization, and there may not be enough peer-reviewed and published journal articles of the quality needed to meet the AMA requirements for a new CPT code. CPT-3 is another category of temporary code issued by the AMA, known as CAT-3 or T codes, that are used to track the utilization of emerging technologies, services, and procedures. Obtaining a Category 3 code does not require FDA approval or clearance first, nor does it require published peer-reviewed evidence for the procedure, but it does benefit from the support of appropriate professional societies to get granted. A Category 3 code may be assigned to an ambulatory payment classification level by Medicare, just like CPT-1 and C codes. There are certain advantages to a CAT-3 code. They are published every 6 months rather than once a year for Category 1 codes. There's a much lower threshold required for supporting data. They are granted early in the coding process and are used to track usage and costing of the procedure. And they provide the possibility of payment assignment and specific coverage rules during the investigational or early adoption phase of the new technology. There are certain disadvantages as well, the main one being that there is a system-wide bias that Category 3 codes are unproven or lack FDA approval or authorization, resulting in blanket non-coverage decisions for services described by the Category 3 code. Payment is the amount of money assigned to a CPT-1 code for physician and facility work, or to a C code for facility work only. It does not signify that the assigned amount will be paid. Rather, it is used by payers to determine how much they would be paid if the code is covered, meaning if it is actually paid. Payments also can be assigned to CP3 codes. Payments are assigned separately to facilities and to physicians. Payment and payment nomenclature differ depending upon where the procedure is performed: hospital inpatient, hospital outpatient, ASC, or doctor's office. But at least in the outpatient setting, they are ultimately all related to CPT codes. The AMA RVS Update Committee, or the RUC, recommends to CMS a relative value unit, the RVU, to be assigned to the physician work involved in each medical procedure or CPT code. This recommendation is based upon a written survey of physicians using the technology. CMS can elect to adopt the recommended value as is or make changes to it when it sets payment rates for the physician. CMS also assigns a payment level to the work performed by the facility in delivering the procedure, which is based on claims filed for Medicare patients treated at hospitals. The way that CMS determines this facility payment level is somewhat convoluted, but it is essential that manufacturers understand this process in order to ensure that their procedure is adequately compensated. For a given code, the hospital determines its cost for the code, marks it up by a hospital-specific factor assigned to each individual revenue center at the hospital to arrive at the charges it submits to the patient and to CMS. CMS then discounts the charges by the same specific factors to arrive back at the cost, then takes the geometric mean of the individual costs from each hospital performing the procedure to determine the CMS single determined cost for that procedure. It does this for all procedures for which there is a code. CMS then uses this cost to assign the procedure to an APC level, whose payment level CMS considers to be appropriate for the procedure. Procedures within a given APC are supposed to be similar in terms of clinical use, but this is in fact not always the case. As an example, CMS could assign 2 of our theoretical procedures to APC 1 with a payment of $5,000 and the other 2 to APC 2 with a payment of $7,500. It is crucial to understand how the charges presented to CMS by each hospital performing the procedure impacts the rate CMS sets as possible payment for all hospitals performing the procedure. While every hospital will have different costs and different charge to cost ratios for each revenue center, let's imagine a hospital that does the vast majority of all the cases performed with the new technology. This is often the case with the newly introduced technology. Furthermore, let's imagine that this hospital has a charge to cost ratio of 7 for each of its revenue centers. This ratio is the amount the hospital marks up its cost by to determine its charges, and the factor CMS decreases the hospital's submitted charges by to determine the true cost. If the hospital's actual costs are $7,000, it will charge the patient $49,000 when the charge to cost ratio of 7 is applied. When CMS receives the documented bill, it will reduce the $49,000 by the same factor, arriving back at a cost of $7,000. CMS may assign the code to our hypothetical APC level 2, which pays $7,500 and affords the hospital a slight profit. However, if the hospital's actual costs are $7,000, but its charges effectively only reflect $5,000 of that, CMS will see a charge of $35,000 that it reduces to an effective cost of $5,000. This may cause the procedure to be assigned to our hypothetical APC level 1, which only pays $5,000, and will cause the hospital to lose several $1,000s every time the procedure is performed. By not determining or compiling its charges correctly, a single hospital, if it has performed a majority of the cases performed, can cause the code to be assigned a payment significantly less than the cost of doing the procedure, which in turn may discourage the hospital from allowing the procedure to be performed. This is exactly what happened with focused ultrasound treatments for prostate cancer. Several large volume hospitals submitted non-representative charges to CMS, resulting in CMS assigning the procedure to an APC level that paid an amount much lower than the true cost of performing the procedure. This was even in the face of diligent work by the manufacturers to train the hospitals on how to cost the procedure properly. Every hospital performing the procedure must create a charge master or bill that reflects the true and complete cost of performing the procedure, if the procedure is to have a payment assigned to it by CMS reflecting the true cost of performing the procedure. As mentioned previously, this cannot be emphasized strongly enough. All costs incurred in performing the procedure must be reflected in the charges submitted to CMS for an accurate determination of cost. This includes the cost of disposables, and amortized costs for capital equipment rental charges, etc. Just a single hospital calculating its cost incorrectly may lead to a payment that is below cost if its number of cases is a significant percentage of all cases performed. Coverage is a determination by an insurance payer as to whether to cover a payment, that is, whether the insurance payer will actually pay the filed claim for the procedure. There are dozens of commercial payers in the United States. Each payer makes what can be an independent decision whether a code will be covered or paid. If paid, the commercial payer usually will negotiate with each hospital or network how much will be paid, commonly either a multiple of the CMS payment or a discount off the amounts billed to the patient by the facility and the physician. All right. CMS divides the US into 12 separate Medicare Administrative Contractor Regions, or MACs, to administer Medicare claims and coverage decisions. Each MAC decides independently whether to provide coverage, either on a case-by-case basis or with a blanket local coverage decision, or LCD, that applies to all instances of the procedure. If paid, it is usually paid at 80% of the CMS payment rate, with the patient responsible for the remaining 20%. CMS can also make a national coverage decision, a decision that applies to all MACs and takes precedent over any current or future individual MAC decisions. A CMS national decision is much more difficult to change once issued. As such, manufacturers rarely request one to be issued. If a favorable decision is made, payment for the billed code, less any deductible or copay, is made to the physician and or to the facility by the insurance payer. If the decision is not to cover, the patient must pay the tendered bill or negotiated amounts to the physician and or the facility. Clinical data is always required at one or more times during the regulatory and reimbursement process. For a PMA, the FDA usually requires a rigorous clinical control trial with stringent performance criteria approved by the FDA prior to its start and with oversight provided by one or more institutional review boards. A de novo submission usually requires clinical data on safety and on the effectiveness of the procedure. For instance, does a tissue ablation device ablate tissue? It does not, however, usually require data supporting the clinical efficacy of the procedure. For instance, does it cure cancer, which would require a formal clinical trial and thus a PMA. 510(k) submissions usually do not require clinical trial data, although laboratory demonstration of safety is required. Clinical data may be required during the coding process as well. For instance, the AMA has strict requirements regarding clinical literature used to support a new CPT Category 1 code, including 5 published articles in peer-reviewed journals with a minimum level of evidence of 2A for at least one of the articles. Level 2A is defined as evidence from a systematic review of cohort studies. Clinical data also plays a role in coverage decisions. While clinical data usually is not a factor in CMS coverage decisions, which are driven more by utilization, An independent review of published clinical data often is undertaken by each commercial payer as part of the determination process for coverage decisions on a given code. Clinical data is required at multiple steps in the pathway. Of critical importance is recognition that the clinical data required during the reimbursement process may be of greater rigor than that required during the regulatory process, and this should be considered upfront when making regulatory decisions. Professional societies, medical foundations, institutes, and technology assessment associations also play a role in the coverage process through the issuance of clinical guidelines, clinical research assessment reports, and actual participation in certain decision-making processes. The AMA will seek out the opinion of the appropriate professional society under whose domain a new technology falls to assess its level of support for the technology. During the closed-door hearing of the AMA CPT panel meeting convened to consider a new code request, representatives of involved societies may present in support of or against the new technology. Almost all commercial payers will review and reference clinical guidelines when making their decisions regarding coverage. If the procedure behind a new code is not recommended in the guidelines, the payer may deem it experimental or unproven and therefore not appropriate for coverage. Professional societies impact the pathway at multiple touch points. Inclusion in the society's clinical guidelines may be the key to obtaining commercial coverage and achieving broad-scale clinical adoption. Since payers reference guidelines, and since many societies or tech organizations require or recommend a comparative or randomized clinical trial for inclusion in their guidelines, payers effectively may at times be viewed as requiring a comparative or randomized clinical trial. This potential need for rigorous clinical data at the tail end of the pathway should be considered when crafting a clinical approach to regulatory authorization at the beginning of the pathway. Clinical utilization is a major factor influencing the pathway, specifically when it comes to CMS. A decision by CMS to issue a C code in the absence of a CPT code often is based on demonstrated demand for the procedure. If it appears the Medicare patient population is desirous of the technology, CMS will entertain an application on the part of the manufacturer to issue a C code. As we discussed, CMS determines the payment amount for facilities using claims data submitted from Medicare cases performed at hospitals. This was discussed previously, but again stands re-emphasizing. Every hospital performing the procedure must create a charge master reflecting the accurate and complete cost of performing the procedure, if the procedure is to have a payment assigned to it sufficient to cover the cost of performing it. As mentioned previously, and as cannot be overemphasized, one hospital reporting too low a cost, especially if it is a high volume user of the technology, can determine and reduce the payment level for the entire country, thereby impacting whether the procedure is performed or not nationwide. And make no mistake about it, there's a reason why I'm repeating this point over and over again. Rather than clinical outcomes data, utilization data is often used by a MAC when determining whether to release a local coverage determination. The more the procedure is performed in the MAC region, the greater is the likelihood of a favorable coverage decision. There are several alternative regulatory options for getting a new technology to market. The most noteworthy is arguably the Breakthrough Devices Program. The Breakthrough Devices Program was described at the beginning of this presentation. To recap, the goal of the program is to provide patients and healthcare providers with timely access to breakthrough medical devices by speeding up their development, assessment, and review. Recently, the Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technology, or MCIT rule, was approved, although it is currently on hold by CMS. MCIT, if signed into law, or if actually put into effect, since it's not technically a law, will provide national Medicare coverage as early as the same day as FDA market authorization is given for breakthrough devices, with coverage lasting for 4 years. This new coverage pathway will offer beneficiaries predictable nationwide access to new breakthrough devices to help improve their health outcomes. It is felt that 4 years of Medicare coverage will encourage manufacturers to develop voluntarily the evidence required to show these treatments improve the health of Medicare patients. This period will allow clinical studies to be completed while providing broad immediate access to innovation. When MCIT coverage sunsets, manufacturers will have all current coverage options available, such as a national coverage determination, local coverage determinations, and claim-by-claim decisions. Details of program implementation are still to be defined. In review, the process for taking a novel medical device from regulatory authorization through to payment being made for its use is highly integrated, interconnected, and complex, involving multiple federal agencies, government programs, commercial insurers, professional societies, healthcare practitioners, and facilities. At times, the process represents a series of parallel paths rather than a single serial one. In its condensed and most simple structure, the pathway involves 4 serial steps with major input and influence from 3 generic functions. In its most complete form, it involves dozens of interactions between multiple parties, some circular or parallel in nature, that can differ between commercial and federal payers and even among payers from the same category. There are specialized programs, some of which were explored and many that were not, that may apply depending upon the technology and the patient segment being served, and that may simplify the process significantly. There are 4 main takeaways from this presentation, knowledge of which may prove crucial to realizing clinical and financial success with any newly introduced technology. 1, although FDA regulatory authorization usually precedes reimbursement decisions, strategies for both should be formulated at the same time, bringing their needs for R&D, clinical studies, and marketing in line with each other to minimize cost and time to market and maximize the potential for commercial success. It is typical to not worry about reimbursement-related issues until after regulatory authorization has been achieved, thereby avoiding unnecessary work if regulatory authorization is not received or is delayed. However, the regulatory path taken might be different if consideration is given to issues that will need to be addressed during reimbursement and commercialization. For instance, whether a cancer claim is required for commercial success rather than the lower bar of tissue ablation will suffice. Rather than if the lower bar of tissue ablation will suffice. Mapping out projected timelines to commercial success based upon a range of paths to regulatory and reimbursement success may prove valuable in selecting the best path forward given current and future resources. 2, specifically, clinical data is required at multiple steps in the pathway. It is important to note that clinical data required during the reimbursement process may need to be of greater rigor than that required during the regulatory process. As a case in point, the quality of clinical data required by professional societies when issuing guidelines to include a new technology and by insurance payers to cover the procedure may require more rigor than that required by the FDA for regulatory authorization. While a 510(k) may not require clinical data, and a PMA may require clinical data acquired from a controlled clinical trial under strict IRB oversight, a society or commercial payer may require a comparative or controlled randomized clinical trial showing at least equivalency between the new technology and existing technologies in order to include it in its guidelines. This possibility needs to be considered up front when designing a clinical trial and regulatory strategy, weighing the costs of money and time of tackling the need for rigor up front rather than at the tail end. As repeatedly mentioned, professional societies impact the pathway at multiple touch points, perhaps most importantly when it comes to realizing insurance coverage by commercial payers. Inclusion in a society or a national network's clinical guidelines may be the key to obtaining commercial coverage and achieving broad-scale clinical adoption. Professional societies and networks, such as the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, or NCCN, issue clinical guidelines used by practitioners, commercial payers, and hospital certification boards. If a new technology is not included in these guidelines, physicians may be reluctant to use it Hospitals may be reluctant to allow it to be used, and payers may deem it experimental or unproven, and therefore not appropriate for coverage. And finally, every hospital performing the procedure must create a charge master or bill reflecting the accurate and complete cost of performing the procedure if it is to have a payment assigned to it sufficient to cover the cost of performing it. CMS determines the payment amount assigned to a code by taking the discounted geometric mean of the average charges billed for the procedure by all hospitals performing the procedure on Medicare patients. If a facility does not determine its charges correctly, for instance, by failing to include the cost of disposables or failing to factor in the amortized cost or rental price of the equipment, it will inappropriately reduce its average charge, which will decrease the mean charge CMS calculates from across all hospitals performing the procedure. May result in CMS paying less if payment is made than it costs to perform the procedure, which may force hospitals to determine that they lose money on the procedure and therefore will no longer offer it. Prostate HIFU is a case in point in the United States, where despite disease control rates equivalent to standards of care such as surgery and radiation therapy, but with a side effect profile that is vastly superior and with potential cost savings that range in the billions of dollars if it were used whenever it was appropriate to use it. Only about 3,000 procedures have been done using the technology since its regulatory authorization in 2015. This can be laid squarely at the feet of payment not being high enough to allow hospitals to recoup the cost of doing the procedure and therefore not allowing the procedure to be done. In conclusion, it is impossible to plan for all contingencies when bringing a new technology to market, especially when it comes to the critical areas of regulatory and reimbursement. While consultants can be helpful, having an in-house understanding of these general processes, of the interdependencies between them, and of the need to approach them in parallel rather than serially, will allow a game plan to be created representing a realistic assessment of the resources required for achieving commercial success and the time it will take to do so, minimizing the likelihood of surprises down the road. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that presentation, Mark. In my mind, you did a remarkable job of breaking down something that is enormous and highly complex. So thank you for all the effort that went into this. So if people have questions, feel free to enter them in the Q&A feature. In the meantime, I'm going to take advantage of my position as moderator to ask Mark some questions. So Mark, you described the cost of the various FDA applications. What about the time frame? How long does a 510K submission usually take to get cleared compared to de novo or PMA application? I think this could factor into a company's decision which route to go if they're given that route.
Sure, thank you, Michael. For 510K, the timeline is approximately as follows. Once a submission is filed, the FDA has 15 days by law to accept the application. It then goes through a substantive review process, which is required to take no more than 60 days, and an interactive review with the submitter, adding up to a total of 90 days from the start of the process. It's important to note that the FDA days are calculated as the number of calendar days between the date of submission and the date of decision, excluding days where the submission was on hold. For instance, if the FDA sends a question out, waiting for the manufacturer to respond, the timeline is put on hold and then restarted again once the manufacturer responds. For PMAs, the agency has to notify the submitter within 45 days of receipt of the submission as to whether the application achieves a minimum level of acceptability and therefore will be acted on by the FDA. The FDA may refer the PMA to an outside panel for review as well, but ultimately they are shooting for a timeline that allows the submission to be done within 180 days of the data filing, again, using the clock start-stop mechanism that I described. With a PMA, the submitter will receive either an approval order, which means it's good to go, an approvable letter, which means it will be good to go with some minor changes being made, a not approvable letter, which means there are major deficiencies that could be addressed if the manufacturer elects to do so, and then an order denying approval, which means that the application has been denied, usually due to procedural issues, which can be corrected if the manufacturer decides to do so. For de novo, which is newly added within the past decade or so, the FDA will send an acceptance letter within 15 days, and their statutory goal is to have the application processed within 120 FDA days. Typically, the FDA has failed to meet that 120-day timeline. Their goal for 2022 is that 70% of de novo submissions will be processed fully within 120 days.
Okay, we've got a question here that I know is near and dear to both our hearts. You emphasized several times that current prostate treatment procedure is underpaid. Can it be changed? Can that be fixed?
CMS's process is that in year 2, it reviews data from year 1 to set the rate for year 3. So translating that into our current time frame, in 2021, under normal circumstances, the FDA would have taken data from 2020, reviewed it in 2021, and used it to set a rate for 2022. That's the way that things get changed. That is if hospitals started to bill correctly, then the claims data numbers would go up, which would result in a higher payment rate. Unfortunately, COVID has impacted this just like it has impacted everything else. Because hospitals were basically shut down for elective procedures last year, the FDA decided that they were not going to use 2020 data to determine 2022 payment rates. They were going to use 2019 data again. For HIFU, this was unfortunate because due to the work of the 2 manufacturers in the space, working diligently with the hospitals that had some billing issues, they were able to help the hospitals raise the average cost of the procedure significantly, to the point where many outsiders believed that if 2020 data had been used, the payment would be raised in 2022. That data was not used. There is an appeal process underway that may, if successful, result in assignment of prostate-focused ultrasound to a higher APC group, but it will require CMS to make an exception to what data they used for calculation this year. If it doesn't happen for 2022, I would bet very strongly that it will happen for 2023 because the data will continue to mature, assuming that procedures are still being done.
So here's a good relevant question. How does a company prevent this from happening? How can you take a proactive stance to ensure that you're not seeing these peaks and valleys for reimbursement?
Yeah, this question is at the crux of the matter. In the defense of the 2 manufacturers in the prostate space, they did issue billing guidelines, as all companies do when they put out a new technology. And they did attempt to work with facilities to help them to understand how to bill properly. Unfortunately, hospitals are very reluctant to take advice from manufacturers because they believe that the manufacturer has ulterior motives in trying to structure payments in a certain way. In addition, as is reasonable to expect, hospitals are the ones that have experience in doing billings, and therefore it is not unreasonable to assume that they will know how to do it properly. I think the only way to get around this for a new company in this space is to basically assign an individual knowledgeable especially a third party, if possible, or a physician advocate, to make sure that they work with the hospital to review the charge master, to review the bills, to make sure that they're structured properly. Manufacturers technically cannot see the bills. They can't get them from CMS. Sometimes it's possible to get one through back doors in order to see what hospitals are doing. But it really takes a concerted effort that I believe should be started well before the product ever enters the market. Because as evidenced in the prostate cancer space, if this is not executed as well as possible, it can have severe impact down the road.
So you've spoken about HIFU, the EDAP and Sonicare/Sonoblate example. What about under MRI guidance? Do you have any thoughts based on the cost input on whether that it will be or should be higher?
If we're talking about intracranial procedures, focused ultrasound ablation for movement disorders, et cetera, I believe that over time, it is reasonable to expect that the payment level will go up, but it is dependent upon the number of cases being performed. There are still very few sites doing these procedures and very few cases being performed. As more cases are done, as there is more solid data as to what the cost is, then I think there is hope that the payment will go up. It's important to keep in mind, however, that Medicare payment is tightly linked to cost. And cost by hospitals is a true representation of what it actually costs them to do the procedure. The system is gamed so that hospitals are not supposed to make money on Medicare patients. When commercial carriers price these procedures, be it HIFU ablation or focused ultrasound ablation for prostate cancer or the intracranial procedures, that is where we will see higher payment rates, because in general, commercial carriers pay anywhere from 2 to 5 times what Medicare pays. And that's where hospitals are able to make the money necessary to be able to afford to treat Medicare patients at cost. I think the true answer here, as I'm sure most people on this call probably would agree with, is that we need a procedure-based or a disease-based payment system in the United States, which says if you have a movement disorder, regardless of what treatment is used, this is how much is going to be paid. And in instances like that, focused ultrasound almost invariably costs significantly less than surgical or radiation oncology-based procedures, and therefore I think we will see it become a dominant player. There is a movement within CMS to do this. In the past several years, they have tried and to some degree successfully implemented a procedure-based payment system within the field of radiation oncology, where whether you do 5, 10, 15, 20 procedures, whether you use a gamma knife or a LINAC radiosurgical device or a linear accelerator, the payment is the same for a specific disease indication. We'll see whether that continues to bear fruit moving forward.
Yeah, maybe that can be our next webinar, transactional versus outcomes-based payment systems.
Yeah, I think that would be very worthwhile, if only in order to provide ammunition for manufacturers, for practitioners, and for hospitals to use when they go and meet with CMS and with our congressional representatives.
So here's a question, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but is there a threshold number of sites that need to charge at a different cost before you see the modification of reimbursement? Yeah, I know this gets complex because it depends on the volume at that site, and it depends on the APC levels and all that sort of stuff. But
right. There is not a number. So CMS will set its payment rate based upon whatever data it has. If there's only one hospital doing a procedure and one case done, CMS will base its payment data on that one case. But let's assume that there are 10 facilities doing the procedure. And each of those, 9 of those 10 procedures do 10 cases each. And the 10th facility does 100 cases. Then the 10th facility is going to control 50% of the final charge determination. And that's the way you need to do your numbers. And it is, one could make the argument that you need to be careful in the hospitals that you select to roll your technology out to. One of the problems that prostate focused ultrasound ran into is that the technology was extremely attractive to non-mainstream hospitals who couldn't compete on the robot prostatectomy basis with the big city down the road, but could compete on focused ultrasound basis, since the large academic hospital was reticent to put focused ultrasound in the first place. So you get hospitals that have never had experience with impacting the payment level in the United States. And as a case in point, when I was at Sonicare and we went and met with one of these hospitals, we sat in the room with their reimbursement people, with their billing people, and with their CEO, and they looked at us aghast and in shock when we told them that they were determining what the payment level was for the United States. Their response was, how is that even possible? We're just a little hospital in Podunk somewhere. How can we be determining what big hospitals in New York City charge? I advise as gently as possible to manufacturers, think about with whom you are working before you start to work with them when you're considering this reimbursement path, because it may negatively impact the technology down the road.
So Mark, we've got just less than 3 minutes left, and I'm going to give you a long question I need a quick answer to. You've been through this process before. Pretending you're a small company with limited funds, would you recommend going ahead with the clinical trial data that's sufficient for approval that you can fund, or would you raise more money and therefore get diluted in order to acquire the clinical data needed for, let's say, a positive coverage determination or commercial coverage?
Great question. Most likely a much longer answer, but a brief answer is, I think the solution here is to try and address this question at the beginning, rather than after you've already done the initial clinical trial. Because if you had asked the question at the beginning and looked at what might be necessary in order to meet guideline standards, you might have been able to build that into your clinical trial upfront and therefore save money. But given where you are now, assuming that this company, this hypothetical company, has already done a clinical trial, already gotten FDA approval, and is trying to decide how to move forward, I think that depends upon your shareholders, your investors, and how likely it is that you will get guideline authorization by something like NCCN, which is most influential when it comes to cancer, before making that decision. And as many folks at the foundation are glad to do, we're more than glad to talk with you privately and individually about your specific issues if you want to reach out through either the focused ultrasound general information email address or to me directly.
Thanks, Mark. I think we'll stop there. This concludes today's webinar. If your question was not answered or you'd like more information, please visit our website at fussfoundation.org or email us at info@fussfoundation.org. Thank you so much for joining us today, and please stay tuned to our newsletter and website for invitations to future webinars and online events. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great day. Thank you, Mark.
Bye.